Undercover boss saw ex-convict chopping veggies at 3 a.m., then found out why he done that. The tattoos on Marcus Cole's forearms told stories most people didn't want to hear. Prison ink, crude and faded, peeked out from beneath rolled-up sleeves as his knife moved through carrots with surgical precision. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the kitchen of Sullivan's Grill in downtown Phoenix should have been empty. Richard Sullivan had built his restaurant empire on instinct. 15 locations across the Southwest, $40 million in annual revenue, and a reputation for quality that kept customers coming back. But lately, something was rotting from the inside. His Scottsdale flagship was hemorrhaging money, staff turnover hit 80%, and anonymous complaints flooded corporate about toxic management and dangerous shortcuts. So Richard did what billionaires rarely do. He stepped off his penthouse floor and into a janitor's uniform. Nobody at the Scottsdale location knew his face. He'd stayed deliberately invisible, letting his COO handle public appearances. Tonight, Rick was just another middle-aged guy trying to pay bills with a mop and a name tag. Gray coveralls, worn work boots, a baseball cap pulled low. Perfect camouflage. The sound hit him first. Thwack, thwack, thwack. Rhythmic, mechanical, relentless. Richard followed it past the industrial dishwashers, past prep stations still reeking of yesterday's grease, until he reached the far corner where a single flickering light barely illuminated the cutting board below. Marcus Cole, 34 years old according to the employee file Richard had memorized, stood hunched over a mountain of vegetables that could feed an army. His chef's whites were spotless despite the hour. His movements were precise, almost robotic. No music, no phone, no distraction. Just him, the knife, and what looked like punishment disguised as work. Richard watched for 2 full minutes. The kid never looked up, never paused, never showed any sign of being human rather than machine. "Hell of a time to be working," Richard finally said, keeping his voice casual. The knife stopped mid-slice. Marcus's head snapped up, eyes going wide with a startled look of prey caught in headlights. But then his face smoothed into something careful, guarded. "Prison taught men to wear masks. You the new maintenance guy?" Marcus asked, voice flat. "That's me, Rick." Richard gestured at the cutting board. "You always do prep at 3 in the morning?" "Someone's gotta do it." Marcus returned to his carrots, though his movements were now slightly rigid, aware of being watched. "Kitchen gets slammed during service. If this isn't done by 6, they start behind." Richard leaned against the prep table, studying him. Marcus's hands were steady, but there was something hollow in his eyes. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't touch. "You pull graveyard often?" "Every night." Marcus's jaw tightened. "By choice?" The answer hung between them, heavy with things unsaid. Richard had interviewed hundreds of employees over the years. He'd learned to read silences. This wasn't burnout. This wasn't someone chasing overtime pay. This was something else entirely. "Kitchen's dead this time of night," Richard pressed gently. "Can't be more than a handful of orders. Why not work days when it's busier? Better tips if you're on the line." "I like the quiet." Marcus finished the carrots and reached for bell peppers, his movements practiced, efficient. "Besides, I'm not after tips. I just need the hours to be these hours. That's all." Richard knew when to back off. He nodded, made a show of checking his clipboard, headed toward the walk-in freezer. But as he passed Marcus's station, something caught his eye. There, taped to the metal shelf beside the cutting board, was a photograph. Small, edges worn from handling. It showed a little girl, maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding up a crayon drawing of what might have been a dinosaur. Written in faded marker along the bottom, "Daddy's #1 chef love, Emma." Richard felt something twist in his chest. "Rick." Marcus was looking at him now, really looking, with an expression that was part wariness and part desperate hope. "You seem different than most maintenance guys." "How so?" "You actually listen." Marcus wiped his knife on his apron, immediately went back to chopping. "Most people don't." Richard felt the weight of those words. How many people like Marcus were working in the shadows of his empire, unseen and unheard? How many had he overlooked while chasing quarterly growth and profit margins? "Just doing my job," Richard said quietly. "Yeah." Me too. The conversation ended there, but Richard couldn't shake that photograph. Daddy's #1 chef. What had put an ex-convict in a kitchen at 3 a.m., working like his life depended on it? What was he running from, or toward? Richard finished his fake inspection and headed for the exit. But before he left, he glanced back one more time. Marcus was still there, still chopping, still alone under that flickering light that made him look like a ghost haunting his own life. Richard made a decision right then. He didn't know Marcus Cole's story yet, but he was damn sure going to find out. Because something told him that whatever kept this ex-con in the kitchen at 3 a.m. wasn't dedication or ambition. It was desperation wearing a prison tattoo and a chef's coat. And if you're curious about what Richard discovered next, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because this story is just getting started. Richard didn't go home after his shift. He sat in his rental car in the parking lot, watching the sun bleed orange across the Phoenix skyline, and made a call to his head of security. I need a background check. Marcus Cole. Employee ID 7834, Scottsdale location. Everything. Criminal record, employment history, parole status if applicable. I need it by noon. The file arrived at 11:47 a.m., and it was worse than Richard had imagined. Marcus Cole had served 6 years in Arizona State Prison for armed robbery. Released 18 months ago on parole. Before that, a decorated line cook at 2 upscale restaurants in Tempe. Multiple culinary competition wins. Letters of recommendation from James Beard nominees. Then, one night in 2017, everything collapsed. Details were scarce, but the arrest report mentioned desperation and medical debt. Richard's gut twisted. There was always more to the story. He returned to Sullivan's Grill that evening at 9 p.m., this time catching the tail end of dinner service. The kitchen was chaos incarnate. Tickets printed in rapid-fire succession, sauces bubbled violently on burners, and servers moved like nervous prey through the swinging doors. In the center of it all stood Chef-Director Glenn Hartwick, a barrel-chested man in his 40s with a voice that could shatter glass and an ego that filled the room like grease smoke. "Where the hell are my scallops?" Glenn screamed at a young prep cook who looked about 17 and terrified. "You think this is a game? You think customers pay $60 for cold seafood?" "Chef, I'm sorry, sorry doesn't feed people." Glenn grabbed the plate and slammed it into the trash with a metallic crash that made everyone flinch. "Start over. And if you screw it up again, you're out. I got 50 applications sitting on my desk from people who actually want to work." Richard watched from the dish pit, hands submerged in scalding water, pretending to scrub pans. This was the rot he'd sensed from his office. Glenn Hartwick had been with Sullivan's Grill for 8 years, promoted to Scottsdale chef director 3 years ago. On paper, he was efficient. In reality, he was a tyrant. "Hey, Rick." A server named Angela slid next to him, dumping a tray of dirty plates. "You picked a hell of a night to work, Dish. Glenn's on a rampage." "He always like this." Angela snorted. "This is him on a good day. Last week, he threw a sauté pan at Tommy's head. Missed by an inch. Corporate got an anonymous complaint, did some fake investigation, then swept it under the rug." She lowered her voice. "Glenn's brother-in-law is regional VP. Nobody touches him." Richard filed that information away like a grenade with the pin pulled. At 2:30 a.m., the kitchen finally emptied. Richard grabbed his clipboard and headed for the walk-in, knowing Marcus would be starting his shift soon. But voices stopped him outside the chef's office. Angry voices. "You're telling me you can't cover a double tomorrow?" Glenn's voice dripped with contempt. "What kind of excuse is that?" "Chef, I told you last week I have a parole meeting at 4. It's mandatory. If I miss it, they violate me." Marcus. Richard pressed himself against the wall, listening. "Oh, so your criminal problems are more important than my kitchen." Glenn laughed, sharp and cruel. "Let me explain something to you, Cole. You're lucky I even hired you. You think any other restaurant would touch an ex-con? You're damaged goods. So when I tell you to work a double, you say yes, chef, and figure out your parole officer situation on your own time." Silence stretched for 3 seconds. "Yes, chef." Marcus's voice was dead. Defeated. "Good. Now get out. Your vegetables are waiting. The office door opened. Marcus emerged, face blank, shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Richard caught a glimpse of his eyes, not angry, not resentful, just hollow. The look of someone who'd accepted that life would keep kicking him because standing up meant losing everything. Marcus walked past without seeing him, disappeared into the kitchen. Richard stood there, rage building in his chest like steam in a pressure cooker. He'd built Sullivan's Grill on a philosophy: respect your people, and they'll respect your food. But somewhere along the way, men like Glenn had twisted that into something rotten. He followed Marcus into the kitchen. Found him at his station, already working through onions with that same mechanical precision. Rough night? Richard asked carefully. Marcus didn't look up. Every night's rough. That boss of yours seems like a real piece of work. He's the boss. Marcus's knife moved faster, harder. Doesn't matter what I think. It should matter. Marcus finally stopped, looked at Richard with something sharp in his eyes. You don't get it, Rick. Guys like me don't get choices. I did my time, paid my debt, but society doesn't care. Every application I filled out got thrown in the trash the second they saw my record. Glenn knew that when he hired me. He knew I'd take any abuse, any hours, any pay, because I'm desperate. His voice cracked slightly. You know what desperation tastes like? It tastes like swallowing your pride every single night and saying yes, chef, to a man who treats you like garbage. Richard felt every word like a punch. Why do you stay? Marcus's hand moved to his pocket, pulled out a phone with a cracked screen. He tapped it twice, showed Richard a photo. The same little girl from the taped photograph, but newer. She was wearing a school uniform, gap-toothed smile even bigger. Emma. She's 8. Lives with her mom in Tucson. Marcus's voice softened, broke. I send them every penny I can. Child support, plus extra. Her mom lost her job last year. Emma has asthma. Medical bills are crushing them. So yeah, I work every night shift available. I take Glenn's abuse, I swallow my pride, because that little girl shouldn't suffer for my mistakes. He pocketed the phone, returned to his onions. The robbery, Richard said quietly. The one that put you inside. Was it for her? Marcus's jaw clenched. The knife stilled. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Emma was 5. Had an asthma attack so bad she stopped breathing. Hospital saved her life, then handed us a bill for $47,000. Insurance denied the claim. Said it was a pre-existing condition. We had nothing. I was just a line cook making $16 an hour. Her mom worked retail. We were drowning. He took a shaky breath. So I walked into a convenience store with a kitchen knife and robbed it. Got $340. Got arrested 20 minutes later. Got 6 years. The words hung in the air like smoke you couldn't escape. That's why you work nights, Richard said, pieces falling into place. Why you need these exact hours. Parole conditions. I have to check in every week, can't leave the county without permission, have to maintain employment. Night shift is all Glenn would give me. Says ex-cons don't deserve prime hours. Marcus finally looked at Richard, really looked, with eyes that carried 6 years of concrete walls and missed birthdays. But at least it's something. At least Emma gets to eat. Before Richard could respond, Glenn's voice exploded from the doorway. Cole. You getting paid to chat or chop? Because I'm happy to find someone else who can do both. Yes, chef. Sorry, chef. Marcus's mask slammed back into place. Glenn's eyes slid to Richard. And you, dishes don't wash themselves. Get back to work before I call your supervisor. Richard bit his tongue hard enough to taste copper, nodded, walked away. But his hands were shaking with barely controlled fury. Because he'd just discovered exactly what was rotting his empire from the inside. And Glenn Hartwick had no idea that the janitor he just dismissed was about to become his worst nightmare. Richard ended his undercover stint Friday morning, but the investigation was just beginning. Back in his downtown Phoenix penthouse, he assembled a team: Jennifer Park, his head of HR, Michael Torres, chief legal counsel, and someone unexpected, Detective Sarah Chun, his college roommate's daughter who now worked financial crimes. I need everything on Glenn Hartwick, Richard said, spreading files across his glass conference table. Financial records, employee complaints, vendor relationships, social media. If he's dirty, I need proof. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You're asking me to investigate your own employee? I'm asking you to investigate workplace abuse and potential fraud. His brother-in-law is regional VP, which explains how he's avoided accountability. I want to know how deep this goes. What they found over the next 5 days made Richard's blood boil. Glenn had been skimming. Not dramatically enough to trigger audits, but systematically. Fake vendor invoices for premium ingredients that never arrived. Overtime hours claimed for employees who'd actually been sent home early, the extra pay pocketed. Health inspection violations buried through consulting fees paid to the inspectors LLC. Over 3 years, Glenn had stolen approximately $127,000 from Sullivan's Grill while terrorizing his staff into silence. But the real ammunition came from somewhere Richard hadn't expected: social media. Jennifer discovered Glenn's private Instagram account, privacy settings laughably weak, where he posted photos with captions that made Richard want to throw his laptop through the window. One photo showed Glenn holding a bottle of expensive wine. Caption: when you hire ex-cons, you gotta hide the good stuff. Face with tears of joy. #prisoners gotta earn #chef's life. Another showed the kitchen late at night. Caption: my dishwasher thinks he's a chef. Stick to scrubbing, criminal. #know your place. #kitchen hierarchy. There were dozens more. Each one more damning than the last. Can we use these? Richard asked Torres. The lawyer smiled grimly. Hostile work environment, criminal harassment, defamation. These posts alone could bury him. Add the financial fraud, and he's looking at felony charges. But Richard wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet. Because taking down Glenn wasn't enough. He needed to build something better in its place. On Tuesday, Richard made a call to Marcus directly, asking him to meet at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the restaurant. Marcus arrived looking suspicious, defensive, like he was expecting termination papers. Relax, Richard said, sliding a coffee across the table. You're not in trouble. I need to talk to you about Glenn. Marcus's face went carefully blank. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus, I'm not HR. I'm not corporate. I'm Rick, the maintenance guy who actually listened. Richard leaned forward. I know what Glenn's been doing. The abuse, the scheduling manipulation, the way he uses your record as leverage. And I'm going to stop it. But I need your help. Why? Marcus's voice was hard, skeptical. Why do you care? Because I used to work in kitchens before I got into maintenance, Richard lied smoothly, sticking to his cover. I've seen guys like Glenn destroy good people. And you're too talented to let that happen. Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, he pulled out his phone. You want to know what Glenn's really like? Marcus tapped through his photos, showed Richard a series of text message screenshots. Messages from Glenn sent at 2 a.m. Cole, you're covering Saturday double or you're fired. Don't care about your parole meeting. Figure it out. Another, your mistakes cost me money. I'm docking your pay $200. Complain and I'll make sure you never work in a kitchen again. Another, sent last month, reminded your parole officer today that you work for me. 1 call and you're back inside. Remember that next time you think about complaining. Richard felt his jaw clench. He threatened to get you violated? 3 times. Marcus's voice was flat. He knows I can't fight back. I report him, he calls my PO and lies. Says I was stealing, or threatening people, or breaking parole conditions. Without proof, who do you think they'll believe? The successful chef or the ex-con? What if you had proof? Marcus blinked. What? Richard pulled out a small device from his pocket, a digital voice recorder, the kind you could buy at any electronics store. I want you to record him. Get him on tape threatening you, abusing staff, admitting to any policy violations. Arizona is a one-party consent state, meaning you can legally record conversations you're part of without telling the other person. You're insane. But Marcus was staring at the recorder like it was a loaded gun. If he finds out. He won't. You're already at work every night until dawn. You're already in his office getting screamed at. Just hit record before you walk in. Richard slid the recorder across the table. 1 week. That's all I need. Can you do that? Marcus's hand hovered over the device. Richard could see the war in his eyes, hope fighting with fear, desperation fighting with self-preservation. Finally, Marcus picked it up. 1 week, he said quietly. Then what? Then we burn his empire down. Over the next 6 days, Marcus recorded everything. Glenn screaming racial slurs at a Latino prep cook. Glenn admitting to a vendor that he was billing Sullivan's corporate for deliveries he never ordered. Glenn explicitly telling Marcus that ex-cons don't deserve fair treatment, and that he'd bury him if Marcus ever complained to HR. Each recording arrived in Richard's inbox via encrypted email. Each one added another nail to Glenn's coffin. But on day 7, something shifted. Richard arrived for his Thursday night shift and immediately sensed wrong. The kitchen was too quiet. Marcus's station was empty. And Glenn stood near the walk-in with a smile that made Richard's stomach drop. "Hey Rick," Glenn called out, voice dripping with false friendliness. "You seen Cole tonight?" "No. Why?" Glenn's smile widened. "Guess he finally figured out he wasn't cut out for real kitchen work. Called in, said he quit. Probably violated his parole already. You know how those guys are, can't stay clean." Richard's blood ran cold. He pulled out his phone the moment Glenn walked away, dialed Marcus's number. Straight to voicemail. He texted, "Where are you? Are you okay?" Nothing. 45 minutes later, Richard was driving through Phoenix at midnight, heading toward the last address he had for Marcus, a motel on the outskirts of the city. His hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. When he knocked on room 237, the door opened a crack. Marcus stood there, face bruised, one eye swollen shut, lip split. "Jesus Christ," Richard breathed. "What happened?" Marcus's good eye was empty. Dead. Glenn found the recorder. "He was going through my bag during shift change. Said he had a tip I was stealing." "Did he?" "He didn't call the cops. Didn't have to." Marcus's voice was hollow. "He called my parole officer instead. Told them I threatened him with violence, that I was unstable. My PO is coming tomorrow to violate me. I'll be back in prison by next week." Richard felt rage crystallize into something sharp and focused. "No, you won't. You don't understand. It's over. Glenn won. He always wins." Richard met Marcus's broken gaze with steel in his own. "Not this time. Pack your things. You're coming with me." "Where?" Richard smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. "To finish what we started. Glenn Hartwick just made the biggest mistake of his life. He assumed I was actually a janitor." The corporate boardroom of Sullivan's Grill looked nothing like a kitchen. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Phoenix. Polished mahogany table. Leather chairs. The kind of room where careers were built and destroyed with PowerPoint presentations and handshakes. Glenn Hartwick walked in at 9 a.m. Monday morning wearing his chef's coat like armor, confident smile plastered across his face. He'd been summoned for what HR called a routine performance review. His brother-in-law, Regional VP Tom Bradley, had assured him it was just formalities. What Glenn didn't know was that Tom Bradley wasn't in the building. He'd been placed on administrative leave 3 hours earlier. Glenn's smile faltered when he saw the room. 12 people sat around the table. Corporate lawyers. HR representatives. 2 people from the Arizona Attorney General's office. Detective Sarah Chen. And at the head of the table, a man Glenn had never seen before in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Glenn's monthly salary. Richard Sullivan. "Mr. Hartwick, thank you for joining us," Richard said, voice calm and cold. "Please sit down." Glenn's confidence cracked slightly. "What's this about? Where's Tom?" "Mr. Bradley is currently under investigation for enabling workplace harassment and financial fraud. He won't be joining us." Richard folded his hands on the table. "You, however, have some questions to answer." Glenn's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Richard nodded to Jennifer, who clicked a remote. The wall screen flickered to life, showing Glenn's Instagram account. Post after post of racist comments, abusive captions, photos mocking his employees. Glenn's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. That's just social media, Richard continued. Let's talk about the real crimes. Another click. Financial spreadsheets appeared. Highlighted transactions showing fake vendor invoices, skimmed overtime, buried health violations. Over 3 years, you've stolen $127,000 from this company. That's felony fraud. You can't prove. We have the bank records, Jennifer interrupted. The shell LLC you created. The deposits that match almost exactly with your fake invoices. We've already traced the money. Glenn's hands started shaking. His eyes darted toward the door, but Detective Chen stood there, arms crossed, blocking the exit. Richard leaned forward. But the thing that really bothers me, Glenn? It's not even the theft. It's what you did to Marcus Cole. At Marcus's name, Glenn's face went from pale to ghost white. The screen changed. Audio player interface. Richard hit play. Glenn's voice filled the room, crystal clear. You're lucky I even hired you. You think any other restaurant would touch an ex-con? You're damaged goods. So when I tell you to work a double, you say yes, chef, and figure out your parole officer situation on your own time. Another recording, ex-cons don't deserve fair treatment. You complain to HR, and I'll bury you. One call to your PO saying you threatened me, and you're back inside. Remember that. Another, I told the vendor to bill corporate for supplies we never ordered. Easy money. Who's going to question a chef's requisitions? The recordings kept playing, each one more damning than the last. Glenn's face had gone from white to gray, sweat beading on his forehead. When the audio stopped, Richard's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Marcus Cole spent 6 years in prison for trying to save his daughter's life. He got out, tried to rebuild, and you tortured him. Threatened him. Used his record as a weapon to abuse him and steal from my company. Richard's calm cracked slightly, rage bleeding through. You beat him unconscious 3 days ago because he tried to document your crimes. Then you called his parole officer and lied to try to send him back to prison. I didn't. We have hospital records, Detective Chen said flatly. Security footage from the restaurant parking lot showing you following Marcus to his car. Witnesses who heard you threaten him. And those recordings you found on Marcus? We have copies. All of them. Glenn was shaking now, full body tremors. This is entrapment. You can't. One-party consent state, Richard said. Every recording Marcus made was completely legal. You knew you were talking to him. You just didn't know he was smart enough to document everything. The door opened. Marcus walked in. He looked different. Clean shirt. Head held high. The bruises on his face had faded to yellow-green, but his eyes were clear. Alive. Burning with something Glenn had spent months trying to crush. Hello, Chef, Marcus said, voice steady as stone. Glenn recoiled like Marcus had slapped him. You quit. You were supposed to be violated and sent back to prison? Marcus smiled, and it wasn't kind. That was your plan. But see, Glenn, you made one critical mistake. You assumed Rick the janitor was just a janitor. Glenn's eyes swung to Richard, confusion and dawning horror mixing on his face. Richard Sullivan, Richard said, standing. Owner and CEO of Sullivan's Grill. I've been working undercover in my own restaurant for 2 weeks. Saw everything you did. Heard everything you said. And when you attacked Marcus, you sealed your fate. Glenn's chair scraped backward as he tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed back down, mouth working silently. Marcus's parole officer has been fully briefed, Jennifer added. Your false accusations have been proven fraudulent. Marcus won't be violated. In fact, the governor's office is reviewing his case for early termination of parole based on exemplary conduct. Detective Chen stepped forward, pulling out handcuffs. Glenn Hartwick, you're under arrest for felony fraud, theft, assault, harassment, and filing a false police report. You have the right to remain silent. As Chen read Glenn his rights, the man who terrorized his kitchen for 3 years started crying. Not quiet tears. Broken, ugly sobs of someone who realized he'd lost everything. My career, Glenn choked out. My reputation. I'm ruined. Yes, Richard said simply. You are. And unlike Marcus, you deserve it. As Detective Chun led Glenn from the room in handcuffs, the assembled group sat in silence. Then Marcus spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Why? He looked at Richard. Why did you do all this? I'm nobody. An ex-con prep cook. Why risk your cover, your time, your resources? Richard walked over, put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Because you're not nobody, Marcus. You're exactly the kind of person I built this company to support. And I forgot that somewhere along the way. He paused. Glenn's gone. Tom Bradley is gone. The Scottsdale location is being completely restructured. And I have a proposition for you. Marcus blinked, still processing everything. What kind of proposition? Richard smiled. How would you feel about running your own kitchen? 6 months later, the new Sullivan's Culinary Center opened in downtown Phoenix with a ribbon-cutting ceremony that made local news. But the real story wasn't the gleaming kitchen or the farm-to-table menu. It was the man standing at the center of it all, wearing a pristine white chef's coat with his name embroidered on the chest. Marcus Cole, executive chef. The restaurant wasn't just beautiful, it was revolutionary. Sullivan's first second-chance kitchen, designed specifically to employ people with criminal records, providing them culinary training, fair wages, and a path forward. 23 employees, all with backgrounds that would normally disqualify them from decent work. All given an opportunity to prove that mistakes don't define futures. Richard stood in the back during the grand opening, watching Marcus command his kitchen with the precision and confidence of someone who'd finally found his place in the world. No more 3 a.m. shifts chopping vegetables in the dark. No more abuse. No more fear. He's incredible, Jennifer said, appearing beside Richard with a glass of champagne. Reservations are booked solid for 3 months. Critics are calling it the best new restaurant in Phoenix. Richard smiled. He always was incredible. He just needed someone to see it. The real transformation, though, showed in smaller moments. Marcus's daughter Emma visited every Sunday, sitting at the chef's table while her father cooked her favorite dishes. Her asthma was under control now, managed with proper medication that Marcus could finally afford. She wore a tiny chef's hat Marcus had made for her, drawing pictures of dinosaurs while he worked. Marcus's ex-wife Sarah had even started talking to him again. Not romantically, that ship had sailed, but with respect and gratitude. The child support payments Marcus sent were consistent now. Emma had stability. Sarah had breathing room. It wasn't perfect, but it was something none of them thought possible 6 months ago. As for Glenn Hartwick, justice had been thorough and unforgiving. Convicted on 14 counts including fraud, theft, assault, and filing false police reports. Sentenced to 8 years in Arizona State Prison, ironically, the same facility where Marcus had served his time. His brother-in-law Tom Bradley had been fired and faced his own charges for enabling the scheme. Both men were professionally destroyed, blacklisted from the restaurant industry permanently. The Instagram posts that had mocked Marcus and other employees became evidence in a civil lawsuit that cost Glenn everything. His house, his savings, his reputation, all gone. The judge had been particularly harsh during sentencing, noting that Glenn's abuse of power and exploitation of vulnerable employees represented the worst kind of workplace predator. Richard had attended the sentencing. Watched Glenn, the man who terrorized his kitchen with arrogance and cruelty, reduced to tears and begging for leniency. When Glenn's eyes found Richard in the courtroom, the recognition hit like a physical blow. The janitor he'd dismissed, the man he'd ordered around, owned the company he'd been stealing from. Glenn's face had crumpled with the weight of his catastrophic miscalculation. But Richard hadn't gone to gloat. He'd gone to witness justice, real, complete justice, for everyone Glenn had hurt. Tonight, at the restaurant's grand opening, Marcus spotted Richard in the back and made his way through the crowd. His face was different now. The hollow exhaustion had been replaced with something bright and alive. Hope, maybe. Or just peace. Mr. Sullivan, Marcus said, using Richard's real name now, still getting used to the formality. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. For Marcus. Richard put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. You did this. I just removed the obstacles. The talent, the work ethic, the heart, that was always yours. Marcus's eyes glistened. Glenn tried to break me. Tried to convince me that my past defined my future. That I'd never be more than an ex-con chopping vegetables in the dark. And instead, you're an award-nominated chef running your own kitchen and employing 23 people who needed the same chance you got. Richard smiled. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building something they said was impossible. Emma appeared then, tugging on Marcus's coat. Daddy, can you make me the chocolate dessert? The one with the gold sprinkles. Marcus knelt down to her level, his entire face transforming with pure joy. Anything for you, princess. Go sit at your table, and I'll bring it out personally. As Emma skipped away, Marcus stood and looked at Richard with an expression of profound gratitude. I used to think my life was over. That one mistake, one desperate choice, had destroyed everything. But you taught me something important. What's that? That people deserve second chances. That our worst moments don't have to become our only story. Marcus glanced back at his kitchen, where his team worked in synchronized harmony, all of them rebuilding lives, all of them proving that redemption was possible. Glenn spent years telling me I was nothing. You spent weeks showing me I was wrong to believe him. Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. You know what the difference is between people like Glenn and people like you? When life knocked you down, you got back up and worked harder. When life knocked Glenn down, he tried to drag everyone else down with him. That's character, Marcus. That's why you're standing here tonight, and he's not. The evening continued with celebration and success. Local news crews interviewed Marcus about the Second Chance Kitchen initiative. Food critics raved about the menu. Emma fell asleep at her table with chocolate on her face and a smile that could light up cities. And in a quiet moment near closing, Richard stood at the window watching the Phoenix skyline, thinking about the journey that brought them here. He'd built an empire on instinct and ambition, then nearly lost sight of why it mattered. It took working undercover, scrubbing dishes, and meeting a man chopping vegetables at 3 a.m. to remember the truth. Success wasn't measured in quarterly profits or restaurant locations. It was measured in lives changed, dignity restored, and people given the chance to prove their worth. Marcus joined him at the window. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking that Glenn tried to destroy you, but instead, he destroyed himself. And you learned that the best revenge isn't payback, it's becoming so successful that your enemies become irrelevant. Marcus nodded slowly. My daughter has a stable life. I have a career I'm proud of. 23 people have jobs when society said they didn't deserve them. That's not revenge. That's justice. That's exactly right. As the last customers filed out and the kitchen staff began their closing routines, Richard pulled out his phone and pulled up his company-wide memo. Tomorrow, he'd announce the expansion of the Second Chance Kitchen program to all 15 Sullivan's locations. Hundreds of people with records would get opportunities they'd been denied everywhere else. Glenn had tried to use Marcus's past as a weapon. Instead, Richard was turning it into a blueprint for transformation. And if this story resonates with you, if you believe in second chances and the power of redemption, subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes the most powerful victories aren't about destroying your enemies, they're about building something beautiful from the ashes of their cruelty. Marcus Cole had been invisible, working in the shadows, surviving on scraps of dignity. Now he stood in the light, proof that one person who truly sees you can change everything. Glenn Hartwick had power, status, and connections. But he ended up in prison, broken and forgotten. Because the real measure of strength isn't how hard you can punch down. It's how well you rise up. And Marcus Cole had risen like a phoenix.